Thank you, Angus, and good morning. Having heard those previous speeches, you get the feeling that we're opening up new frontiers in some way, and despite all, making progress in the move towards a low-carbon world. But as much as we have momentum, there are still many problems to be solved and pitfalls that we haven't even anticipated yet. I suppose that's what a frontier is all about. I intend to talk about Scotland and renewables as a paradigm for progress, and excuse the alliteration. I know I've just talked about problems and pitfalls, but it's a paradigm that's based on collaboration and partnership, another P word, that leverages strengths and connections within and around the world. In doing this, I'll hope to spotlight some of what will be discussed during the rest of the conference. Now, each of us in this hall is engaged in some way with the low-carbon agenda and will hopefully shape its future over the coming years. Individually, we may be financiers or developers, generators or suppliers, policymakers or opinion formers. We may be interested in a supergrid or how to grow our domestic or global supply chain. We may be looking for finance or indeed for investment opportunities. But however diverse our interests are, we're united by a common goal, a commitment to making a low-carbon economy happen here in Scotland and in countries around the world. In some respects, we're all pioneers, another P word. As you know, 2012 is the third Scottish Low Carbon Investment Conference, and this is significant for a number of reasons. It's evidence that there's momentum in and around Scotland sufficient to bring all of us together again. It speaks to expanding expertise, developing infrastructure, R&D activity here. But most important, I think, is that this conference is anchoring Scotland's reputation as a country that takes renewables and the low-carbon agenda seriously and knows how to follow words with action. Scotland isn't just a place to talk about renewables, it's a place where we're making it happen. Whether that's through innovative technologies, helpful policy, or coming together to debate, collaborate, and create alliances. I called us pioneers a minute ago. Coming from America, pioneers, of course, are part of the national lexicon. I mean, you can picture it in your mind, the Wild West, covered wagons, people relying on each other to survive and build a better life in new territories. There were dangers, lots of them, but also vast natural resources to be harnessed, lawlessness, but also hope. That notion of pioneering applies to many contexts, and I think especially right now as we move toward a low-carbon economy. People are traveling to new places, sharing technology, common goals, plans, and also mistakes and challenges. And companies understand that even as competitors, they may gain more at this stage by collaborating to achieve their ambitions. Since this conference last year, the primary focus has broadened from offshore and infrastructure to the funding requirements for energy efficiency and for waste, and to the differing investment needs of communities and cities. Of course, there are still very strong headwinds to investment and ultimate industrialization. We haven't yet solved all the infrastructure challenges. New technologies still need to scale. Regulatory uncertainties abound. Economic pressures today are volatile. Those are the big challenges which sit over a whole host of specific ones. For example, economically, there's the challenge, the gamble even, of investing today in the right technologies for long term when these technologies are evolving so quickly. Financially, regulation has a significant effect on investment. Basel III regulations will be phased in from January next year. The impact on the balance sheets of banks, and in particular on restricting their ability to lend beyond 10 years, when today they might lend 20 years, will change the nature of investment in the renewable sector. As will the uncertainty that surrounds, for instance, the electricity market review, questions over planning, grid connections, grid integration. All of these are major issues. Politically, policies need to be grandfathered when new ones come along, which has typically happened so far. If not, there's a risk of stranded assets. If, for instance, financial support mechanisms such as the renewable obligation were to be changed in a way that affects projects that are already on the drawing board. Philosophically, sometimes it's not always easy to explain what's going on. For instance, in the past, electricity has been sold under cost because so-called negative externalities, the costs of health or environmental remediation, haven't been factored in. But the cost of green energy is almost always discussed in terms of its fully loaded costs. Messages such as this are very often hard to surface to explain. Equally hard is how to respond to the fact that so many people who approve of wind power don't always approve of wind farms. The science of climate change and the economic imperative for renewables don't square for everyone. There are lots of headwinds, lots of reasons to pause, to hold back in the name of caution and uncertainty. We face these challenges in Scotland, and similar ones exist around the world. However, while they could prompt a hiatus in investment, we haven't actually seen that. In fact, for the first time, and we have in some respects, as Angus has shown us, but if you look right around the globe, for the first time last year, there was more investment in renewable energy projects around the world than in new fossil fuel projects. That's in part, I think, because of the pioneering stage that we're at. So as we listen and debate the issues over the next couple of days, I thought we might find inspiration from some pioneers who've gone before us. Going back to the 19th century, I think of Thomas Glover, like the First Minister now, with strong links to the northeast of Scotland. This risk-taking, fast-living entrepreneur, and for the absence of doubt, I refer here to Glover, not the First Minister, spent most of his life in Japan. He moved from trading green tea to trading ships and guns. And he was a modernizer, introducing the steam railway and coal mining to Japan. He became a key figure in the country's industrialization, and especially the development of the Mitsubishi Corporation of Japan. How fitting that we're working so closely in Scotland today with Mitsubishi. I've often compared the renewables industry with the gold rush in California 150 years ago because we're at the start of something new, when there are huge ambitions and very high hopes. And maybe that's what keeps things moving forward despite the significant headwinds I've described. I'll take Scotland as an example of that momentum. We've seen, for instance, significantly increased investment across the supply chain for renewables here in Scotland over the last year. We see that with the launch of Scotland's Marine Energy Park in the Pentland Firth and the announcement of funding for 5 brand new marine energy projects in Scottish waters. The European Marine Energy Centre in Orkney has agreed contracts now for all of its wave and tidal berths. And the first ever community-owned tidal turbine is to be manufactured in Renfrew and deployed in Shetland. Scotland is leading the world, as we've heard, with the highest number of marine projects underway or in planning. And it's home to some of the world's most advanced wave and tidal technology developers. But the road isn't yet easy for them. Full industrialization is still a way off. Moving to wind, onshore wind farms continue to be viewed as an attractive asset class by commercial banks, as well as multilaterals such as the European Investment Bank. The current challenge, however, is that with many of the best large sites already in use, onshore activity has moved to smaller multi-site projects. And the grid and grid connectors need to be upgraded and expanded to take on all the electricity now being produced. Indeed, there are already places in this country where the grid is full, so the infrastructure needs to be addressed urgently. As the expansion of onshore wind slows to some extent, offshore will be a key area of growth in the coming years. With larger capital requirements on the horizon, cost reduction through new materials, new design, and higher performance become all the more important. Companies also want and need reassurance that today's business case will hold up over time, because creating renewable generation, as we know, is a very long-term investment. Stability in the approach to policy and subsidies is just as important as driving down costs, perhaps even more so. As we get more experience with these big projects and costs come down, we should see available investment go up further, because that becomes a virtuous circle. And that applies to much more than marine and wind energy. We're seeing a broader approach to the low-carbon agenda with more focus on energy efficiency and the development of funding to support it. Green transport continues to evolve, inching its way into the market, and only works at this stage in investment terms because of collaboration. One example, Scottish companies Alexander Dennis and Stagecoach have partnered with BAE Systems to develop an electric hybrid bus delivering a 30% reduction in carbon emissions compared to standard vehicles. Stagecoach is taking delivery of 200 of these units for use in their UK operations, and Alexander Dennis is exporting these buses right around the globe. 2 strong Scottish companies breaking new ground with, if you'll forgive me, a latter-day covered wagon. And again, a great example of working in partnership to bring the best product to market quickly, as you'd expect of world leaders in their field. Biomass is also beginning to find traction, and in some respects, in ways that one might see unique to Scotland. For instance, Helios Energy is on track to start producing power from a new plant in Rothes, not far from here. Collaboration between Helios, a group of Highland whiskey distillers, several banks led by Rabobank, and including ourselves as well, will enable the generation of energy from byproducts of the Scotch whiskey industry. And they'll be producing power, enough power to supply about 9,000 homes. And we saw a little bit at the beginning about the partnership between Napier University with Celtic Renewables. They intend to manufacture butanol in order to power vehicles. And again, they're doing this by producing bacteria that feed on leftovers from whiskey distilling. Further evidence of the importance of successful partnering to make things happen. And I'm quite tempted to say that all of you can become our partners as well. There's a whiskey tasting at the end of today's meetings. In case you thought that was simply an expression of Scottish hospitality, you're absolutely wrong. The more whiskey consumed, the more that needs to be produced, the more fodder, if you will, for all of these waste energy experiments. So I tell you that, but I do have to give you the standard warning. I'm not urging you to drink too much or even to drink, but I did want you to think about that late this afternoon. I said earlier that some funders might be tempted to take a more cautious approach to low-carbon investment because of uncertainties, because of the headwinds. But this doesn't mean that investment so far has dried up. In fact, anything but. My own bank, Lloyds, has arranged or underwritten $3 billion of loans across 45 projects in recent years, representing 7 gigawatts of renewable energy, predominantly in wind and solar, but also landfill gas, biomass, and biofuels. And our pace, dare I say another P word, has picked up considerably as we've gained experience. So far this year alone, we're lead arrangers for $1.3 billion in renewable energy projects, including the UK's largest offshore wind farm, Links, where again Lloyds is the lead bank, and that project will in due course power 200,000 homes when it's completed. And we persist in describing these projects in terms of heating and powering so many homes, businesses, communities, because we shouldn't forget that that's the reason we're doing it. We're the largest provider of funding for renewables in the UK, but others are traveling along a very similar road. And for some, I think it's made a little easier as they see my colleagues at Lloyds make a go of it. We're still funding and we're diversifying. We're exploring how to use green bonds. We're starting to think about packaging up investable low-carbon projects for institutional investors. We're doing these things because we see large private equity players such as Blackstone, BlackRock, KKR coming onto the scene. Large infrastructure funds are gaining experience with renewables, and institutional investors showing more interest. Lots of wagon trains. And this isn't just the story in this country. We've just heard about Abu Dhabi. Before today's conference, I'd been thinking about Scotland's ambitions for renewables and how we're delivering this in a much wider context than our own borders. Countries, wherever they are, tend to think they're the center of the world, but there are lots of pivot points, lots of connections. Australia looks to Asia as a natural place to trade. South America looks to North America, but also to Western Australia. Yet there are so often links right back to Scotland, which surprised me on 2 trips earlier this year. I was invited both to Santiago and to Sydney. I was pleased, but also not a little surprised during these trips to discover just how well regarded Scotland and its renewable activities are around the world. I saw that in Santiago, where I was asked to speak at their National Renewables Conference. The Chilean government were looking for examples of leading approaches to renewables in other countries. Seeing online clips of the 2011 Scottish Low Carbon Investment Conference from last year, they reached out through Scotland's 2020 Climate Group. And they asked me there. Now, I like to thread a Scottish story into any speech I make abroad, so on this occasion I mentioned another pioneer. I spoke about a swashbuckling, hard-living buccaneer. Again, not a description of the First Minister, but one Admiral Thomas Cochrane. Born into a naval family nearly 200 years ago, brought up just across the Forth, Thomas Cochrane followed family tradition into the Royal Navy. But after falling foul of his superior officers, this colorful, pioneering Scot journeyed to the other end of the globe and played a key role in the liberation of Chile. In case you wonder, he returned to Scotland in due course. He was forgiven his sins. In fact, the naval base not far from here is named in his honor. It was also the model for two fictional characters, Horatio Hornblower and Captain Jack Aubrey in the Master and Commander series. And he continues to be regarded as an important, indeed heroic figure from Chilean history. Much as they remember him 200 years later, Chileans today are aware of Scotland's low-carbon aspirations. Like so many countries, Chile is facing familiar issues involving, for instance, the grid and also energy security, and they don't want to rely on imports forever. So with a very high level of solar radiation, they've made it up with Spain, and they're now working with Spain on PV solutions. They've developed a new policy around wind energy and are keen to learn from others, particularly ourselves. With 4,000 miles of coastline, Chile is especially interested in Scotland's pioneering work in marine generation. I was amazed as well to meet quite a number of Chileans in Santiago who had studied in Scotland, for example, on carbon master's programs at Edinburgh University, and some of them were looking at the prospect of returning because they saw opportunities here. The people I met were impressed that a country of our size can reach so high and do so much. It doesn't always have to be the big mega powers that shape new agendas. Scotland clearly has a reputation as a country to watch because of its current policy, educational strength, engineering and technology capability, and the vision that drives our low-carbon agenda forward. Now, while some countries may look to us for our technology developments, in other instances we're taking new technology from elsewhere and giving it a significant trial here in Scotland because we have a focus on innovation and we have viable test beds. I was recently interested in such an initiative between two small companies, one from Australia and one Scottish. Zero Waste Scotland connected ACE Recycling Group in Clackmannanshire to a small Australian enterprise which offers effective microbiological techniques to break down green waste in large volumes safer and faster than any other technology. As social entrepreneurs, both companies share a philosophy on green issues and on communities. That's the link between them. Because ACE has a strong platform in Scotland, the Australian company adapted its technology to enable ACE to start developing a closed-loop food waste recycling service. This is exactly the kind of international connection that benefits us all. Sometimes we have the technologies that others want, and sometimes we have the structures to advance others' technologies. I was interested in this connection in light of my Australian visit in March. It came about because the Australian Institute of Company Directors hosts a masterclass for ASX 100 company chairmen and directors, non-executives. Their focus this year was on the ESG, Environment, Social, Governance approach to corporate governance and investment. In this instance, they approached me through SSE, where I sit on the board, to deliver the environment strand of their program. As the UK's largest provider of power from renewable sources, they saw SSE as an exemplar in the low-carbon arena, as well as in governance. So I talked about everything from renewable energy to remuneration, but I did a lot of listening as well. Australian companies are actively debating how investors and asset managers make investment decisions. Many are keen to see those decisions based on more than purely financial results and to take a longer time horizon than just quarterly financials. And this is a goal which I happen to share. If all investors used carbon as well as financial metrics to judge companies, we might not only see long-term value in investor terms coming back into fashion, but also a boost to investment in the low-carbon arena. Let me now draw these strands together. The Scottish Low Carbon Investment Conference, I believe, has cemented Scotland's position as a low-carbon leader. I can't think of a better chance not only to learn about progress over the year, but also to push at the challenges and pitfalls that still exist. If we want private equity and institutional investors to stay interested, it's essential that they see a pipeline of investable projects on the horizon. Will that happen? If we want energy companies and banks to use their balance sheets for these purposes, they need to see finance and policy objectives aligned. How can we ensure that? Biomass and waste projects are attracting far more focus and money, but how do we get them to a scale where they become the only real reasonable way forward? Because otherwise we're just playing at it. There are more conversations now about energy efficiency and how to engage households, but how do we engage households? We haven't seen a stampede yet. The Green Investment Bank, which you'll hear about tomorrow, is focused on offshore wind, non-domestic energy efficiency, and waste. Even more important is that the GIB's presence in a transaction will reduce the perceived level of funding risk and hopefully leverage in new money. But can it move quickly enough with the time constraint it has on its funding? And what about the funding gap ahead of its investment? We're seeing other new sources of financing, both from across a growing number of financial institutions and from new types of products, for instance, green bonds. These also need to move beyond the concept stage, but who's going to take the chance with them? Lots of new challenges, and I would urge you to address some of them at this conference. In fact, that's why you're here. The debate is far more textured than even a year ago. We see many more risks. We understand them far better. The future we're aiming for can come about, but only if we demonstrate the characteristics that I've mentioned: partnership, persistence, perseverance, and pace. I can't think of a better place to do that than at the Scottish Low Carbon Investment Conference in a country which is so committed to the low carbon agenda. Scotland has vision, ambition, confidence, and increasingly vast practical experience. But we're all in this together. As I've said, we're all pioneers, and make no mistake, the world is watching and learning. Thank you very much.